It began with a sealed briefing inside Kensington Palace, one that was never meant to leave the room. Yet within hours, whispers began slipping through the stone corridors, carried not by official channels but by the kind of nervous silence that only appears when something deeply sensitive has been uncovered. A hidden legal clause, buried inside a royal trust document, had reportedly been discovered, and it carried a direct reference to the long-term protection of Catherine's children. Nothing about it was supposed to be visible at this stage of royal planning. Nothing about it was supposed to exist outside a tightly controlled circle. And yet there it was, quietly reshaping the atmosphere of the entire institution. When Princess Anne was shown the file, those present later described a shift in her demeanor that changed the direction of everything that followed. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Inside that same closed-door setting, a confidential legal review was already underway involving Catherine, Princess of Wales, Prince William, and a group of senior constitutional advisors who rarely appear together unless the matter touches the very foundation of royal governance. The discussion was not casual. It was precise, restrained, and heavy with implication. What had been presented to them was not a new policy or a modern adjustment, it was a clause embedded deep within an older royal trust structure, one tied to inheritance planning that stretches across decades of institutional memory. The language, according to those familiar with such frameworks, suggested something deliberate, something carefully constructed rather than accidentally placed. And that alone was enough to shift the tone of the entire room. As the document was examined more closely, its origins appeared to trace back into estate governance protocols overseen during the final years of Queen Elizabeth II's reign, a period already known for its tightly controlled succession planning and long-term institutional safeguards. Yet what made this discovery unsettling was not simply its historical connection, but its specificity. The clause did not speak broadly about royal descendants. It pointed directly, and unusually, toward protections associated with Catherine's children, something that raised immediate questions among those reviewing it. Why them? Why this structure? And why now, at a moment when the monarchy itself was already under pressure from health uncertainty, public scrutiny, and internal transition? In the midst of this escalating uncertainty, Princess Anne was reportedly summoned almost immediately after discrepancies were flagged in succession-adjacent legal frameworks. Her involvement was not ceremonial. It was procedural, but also symbolic, because few within the institution possess her depth of historical awareness when it comes to constitutional continuity. Courtiers later described the urgency surrounding the file movement as unlike standard administrative review. Documents were shifted under what was internally referred to as restricted legacy protection status, a classification reserved for materials that cannot circulate beyond a controlled advisory perimeter. That alone signaled that this was no longer a routine clarification, it had become a matter of institutional sensitivity. Meanwhile, Catherine was described in public-facing appearances as composed, steady, and unchanged in demeanor, maintaining the calm presence expected of her role. But within private accounts circulating among staff and close advisors, a different picture emerged, one of visible restraint, quiet concern, and emotional calculation behind closed doors. Nothing was said openly, yet everything was felt. Prince William, according to those same accounts, was seen offering reassurance during later private family moments, particularly in relation to Princess Charlotte, whose name had become quietly entangled in early discussions surrounding the clause's implications. The connection was never confirmed publicly, but its presence in internal conversations added another layer of unease. As hours passed, an unusual silence settled across multiple palace communication channels. Not denial, not confirmation, simply silence, enforced with a precision that suggested coordinated containment rather than uncertainty. This silence did not calm speculation, it intensified it. Observers within royal media circles began noting that similar patterns often emerge only when internal documents touch sensitive succession structures or long-term legacy protections. The absence of clarification became, in itself, a signal that something deeper was being handled behind the scenes. And yet, Even as the palace attempted to contain the flow of interpretation, one fact remained impossible to ignore. This clause did not appear accidental. It sat too precisely within the framework of royal trust architecture, too specifically aligned with future generational protection, and too narrowly focused on Catherine's direct family line to be dismissed as routine administrative language. The question was no longer whether it existed, but why it existed in the first place, and who had the authority to shape its intent in such a precise direction. But the clause itself was not the shock the identity of who inserted it, and why it specifically protected Catherine's children, pointed to a deeper divide inside the monarchy. The clause was not new, it had been sitting quietly inside a sealed trust framework for years, hidden beneath layers of legal language so precise that even seasoned advisors had passed over it without hesitation. But now, under the growing strain of King Charles III's health and the relentless pressure of succession planning, its presence suddenly felt impossible to ignore. What once looked like a routine safeguard embedded in royal governance had taken on a far sharper meaning. It allegedly granted an extraordinary level of protective consideration specifically to Catherine's children, bypassing the usual financial hierarchies that define how royal assets and future provisions are traditionally structured. In a system where every line of authority is carefully measured, this deviation stood out like a quiet rupture in an otherwise flawless design. The clause itself was reportedly tied to estate governance structures linked to the Duchy of Cornwall and other private trust arrangements that have long formed the backbone of royal financial continuity. These frameworks are typically designed with strict neutrality, ensuring that succession and distribution follow established constitutional expectations without favor or deviation. Yet this particular language, according to those who reviewed it during internal audits, seemed to step outside that neutrality. It referenced historical safeguards that some believe were drafted during the final administrative years of Queen Elizabeth II's reign, a period already marked by heightened sensitivity around future stability and generational protection within the monarchy. During what was initially described as a routine review of royal inheritance structures, legal teams reportedly uncovered subtle inconsistencies in how the clause had been catalogued and classified. Nothing about its existence was illegal or openly irregular, yet its positioning raised immediate questions. Not simply what it said it was, where it had been placed, and how quietly it had survived multiple rounds of institutional scrutiny. That discovery alone shifted the tone of the entire review process from procedural to deeply interpretive, as advisors began to ask whether the clause had ever truly been meant to remain dormant. What made the language even more striking was its unusual specificity. Instead of broad references to royal descendants or general heirs of the crown, it appeared to focus narrowly on the direct lineage of Prince William and Catherine, Princess of Wales. In a system built on uniform succession principles, such targeted framing was rare enough to raise concern and precise enough to invite speculation. Palace insiders, speaking cautiously through layers of discretion, have described it as a form of selective shielding of future heirs within heirs, a phrase that quickly began circulating through advisory circles with increasing unease. The reaction within internal discussions was not uniform. Some viewed the clause as an advanced protective mechanism, a kind of long-range stabilizer designed to ensure continuity for the most direct line of future monarchy. Others, however, saw something more complex and imbalanced that subtly disrupted long-standing traditions of equal structural treatment within royal financial frameworks. This divide only deepened when members of Queen Camilla's inner advisory circle reportedly questioned why only Catherine's children were explicitly named within the protective language and not others within the broader extended family network. That question, once raised, could not easily be dismissed. As debates widened, so too did the tension between traditional succession protocol and the increasingly modernized governance systems that now oversee royal trust structures. On one side stood centuries of precedent, built on consistency, neutrality, and strict constitutional interpretation. On the other, a newer framework of Administrative adaptation designed to secure the monarchy's future in an era of unprecedented public scrutiny and institutional change. The clause, once a quiet technical detail, now sat directly at the intersection of those two philosophies, forcing both sides of the institution to confront uncomfortable questions about intent, fairness, and long-term design. And yet, beneath all the legal interpretation and procedural analysis, a deeper unease began to take shape. Because the more closely the clause was examined, the less it resembled a passive safeguard, and the more it appeared to reflect deliberate architectural choice. As if someone had not only written it, but carefully ensured it would survive long enough to be discovered at exactly the right moment. What appeared to be a protective measure soon began to look like something far more deliberate, a clause that someone had inserted with intent, not caution. Investigators tracing the clause's origin reportedly found themselves pulled backward through time into the final years of Queen Elizabeth II's administrative oversight, where every document was expected to carry the weight of absolute precision. Yet what they uncovered was not a clean archival trail, but a fragmented threads of governance records that did not fully align with each other. At first glance, the clause appeared to belong naturally within the continuity of royal trust planning, but closer inspection revealed subtle distortions in wording that suggested something had been adjusted after its original drafting. And in those adjustments, a single direction began to emerge, one that seemed to quietly favor the direct lineage of Catherine's bloodline in a way no standard protocol would normally isolate. Within the restricted red box archives, multiple versions of what was believed to be the same governing document were reportedly discovered, each carrying slight but significant variations. These were not dramatic rewrites or visible overhauls. Instead, they were incremental edits, small shifts in phrasing, repositioned clauses, softened language spread across years of administrative handling. The effect was cumulative, as though the document had been gently reshaped over time rather than written in a single decisive moment. For those reviewing it, this pattern raised an unsettling possibility. The clause may not have been inserted as a singular act, but instead evolved through quiet adjustments that went largely unnoticed within routine governance cycles. Among the most striking elements was a phrase referencing lineal stability protections, a term that, on its surface, suggested neutrality and continuity. Yet in context, it appeared to subtly prioritize the direct heirs of Prince William, and by extension, the children of Catherine, Princess of Wales. Such specificity was not typical of broad royal inheritance language, which traditionally avoids narrowing focus beyond established constitutional succession lines. Instead, this phrasing seemed to carve out a more defined protective corridor, one that stood slightly apart from conventional hierarchy without openly breaking it. As the complexity of the document grew clearer, Princess Anne was reportedly brought in as a constitutional verifier, her presence carrying the weight of historical familiarity rather than ceremonial formality. Few within the institution possess her long-view understanding of how royal governance has evolved through crises, reforms, and generational transitions. Her task was not simply to confirm authenticity, but to interpret intent, whether the clause reflected deliberate design or unintended accumulation. And in that distinction lay the potential to redefine how the entire structure was understood. The deeper the review progressed, the more uncomfortable the questions became. Was this amendment formally approved by the monarch at the time it first appeared? Or had it been subtly embedded within bureaucratic systems that operate beneath direct royal visibility, surviving repeated audits simply because each version appeared only slightly different from the last? The ambiguity was not accidental, it was structural, and that made it far more difficult to resolve. Even experienced advisors began to acknowledge that the clause might have existed in a gray space between authorization and administration, where intent becomes harder to trace than ink. What intensified the concern further was the growing realization that this may not have been a reactive safeguard at all, but a forward-looking mechanism designed to stabilize future succession pressures long before they materialized. In that interpretation, the clause was not simply about protection, it was about anticipation. A quiet attempt to insulate a specific branch of the family line from future volatility, ensuring continuity even under conditions of internal strain or external scrutiny. Such framing, however, inevitably raised deeper institutional tension, because stability for one line could easily be perceived as imbalance by another. And as these interpretations collided, the document stopped looking like a passive inheritance safeguard and began resembling something far more intentional, an engineered framework hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment, or the wrong crisis, to bring it back into focus. But once Princess Anne examined the clause in full, she reportedly realized it was not just protective, it was politically targeted. Princess Anne reportedly identified something subtle at first, almost invisible to anyone not trained in the long history of royal constitutional design. It was a structural pattern buried deep within the clause, one she had seen before, in earlier moments of royal transition when the monarchy had to protect itself from uncertainty, pressure, and shifting public expectations. But this version was different in a way that immediately disrupted that sense of familiarity. It did not follow the traditional channels of approval, nor did it distribute its protections evenly across the broader framework of succession. Instead, it appeared to concentrate its safeguards with unusual precision around Catherine's children alone, as though the entire structure had been narrowed into a single focal point. For Princess Anne, whose understanding of constitutional mechanics is shaped not by theory, but by decades of lived institutional experience, the recognition reportedly came with immediate concern. She saw what insiders later described as legacy continuity formatting, a method occasionally used in past governance frameworks to ensure stability during sensitive transitions within the royal household. These mechanisms were never meant to privilege individuals. They were designed to protect the institution as a whole. Yet here, the familiar structure had been reshaped, subtly but unmistakably, so that its protective reach did not extend broadly across the royal lineage but instead appeared tightly directed toward the direct descendants of Catherine, Princess of Wales, and Prince William. This deviation was not just technical, it was philosophical. The clause seemed to override long-standing informal expectations within the senior royal household hierarchy. Expectations built on balance, shared continuity, and careful distribution of institutional safeguards. In earlier frameworks, protection was collective, ensuring that no single branch of the family appeared disproportionately insulated. But this version disrupted that equilibrium. It introduced a form of unbalanced protection architecture, a term Princess Anne allegedly used during internal discussions to describe what she believed was a structural departure from established norms. It was not simply about who was included, but about who was not. As the implications deepened, Prince William was reportedly informed in a quiet, controlled briefing, far removed from public visibility. The tone of that conversation was not alarmist, but it carried weight because once such a pattern is identified within constitutional structures, it cannot be ignored or casually set aside. It must be examined, tested, and understood in full context. That moment marked the beginning of an escalation, as the matter shifted from interpretive review into formal internal scrutiny, where every line of the clause would now be treated as potentially intentional rather than incidental. At the same time, unease began to spread beyond the immediate circle of constitutional advisors. The possibility that the clause had been designed not just to protect, but to selectively prioritize, raised broader institutional questions. Some within advisory discussions began to suspect that its structure could be limiting external influence over future heirs in ways that had never been openly debated or formally acknowledged. That suggestion alone was enough to change the atmosphere around the investigation, turning what had begun as a technical discovery into a matter of long-term governance concern. Even within Queen Camilla's advisory network, questions were reportedly raised about the clause's unusually narrow scope. Clarification was requested regarding its exclusionary implications, particularly why protections appeared concentrated in a way that did not align with broader family frameworks. The tone of these inquiries was careful, but unmistakably tense, as if even asking the question acknowledged a shift in internal balance that could not easily be reversed. In a system built on precedent, Anything that breaks pattern is never just detail, it becomes signal. And so, what had initially been treated as a quiet legal curiosity no longer remained contained within procedural interpretation. It had begun to spread across the institutional awareness of the monarchy itself, touching on questions of fairness, intent, and long-term structural design. The deeper it was examined, the less it resembled a passive safeguard, and the more it appeared to be a carefully positioned instrument within the broader architecture of royal continuity. What began as a legal curiosity now escalated into a constitutional confrontation, one that required immediate royal intervention. Behind closed doors, the clause ignited a fracture that the royal household could no longer quietly contain. What had begun as a technical review of inheritance language now split into two sharply opposing interpretations. On one side stood those who believed the clause functioned as a necessary safeguard, a stabilizing mechanism designed to protect continuity in an era of uncertainty. On the other side were voices growing increasingly uneasy, arguing that the structure did more than preserve stability, it subtly redirected long-term influence toward the direct line of Catherine's children, reshaping the internal balance of future authority in a way that could not be easily undone. Within this tension, Catherine herself remained publicly silent, maintaining the calm, composed presence expected of the Catherine, Princess of Wales. Yet behind that silence, she had quietly become the gravitational center of private discussions, even when she was not physically present in the room. Every interpretation of the clause, every legal reading, and every constitutional concern seemed to eventually circle back to her family line. It was not accusation, but inevitability, because the language of the clause itself kept pointing in that direction, regardless of how carefully it was analyzed or reframed. Meanwhile, Prince William was reportedly aligned with a growing push for transparency, supporting the idea that the clause should undergo deeper review rather than remain confined within restricted advisory interpretation. His position, as described by those familiar with internal discussions, was not confrontational but firm-rooted in the belief that anything affecting future succession clarity must withstand full constitutional scrutiny. That stance, however, intensified the divide, because transparency in such matters often means exposure, and exposure in royal governance carries consequences that extend far beyond legal interpretation. Elsewhere within the institution, Queen Camilla's household reportedly raised its own concerns, focusing on what they perceived as an imbalance in structural emphasis. The argument was not framed as opposition to protection itself, but rather to the selective nature of its application. Why, they questioned, did the clause appear to concentrate so specifically on one branch of the family line? In a system built on carefully maintained equilibrium, even subtle asymmetry can feel significant. And once that perception formed, it began influencing how the clause was discussed across multiple advisory layers. At the center of all this remained King Charles III, described by insiders as cautious and increasingly reluctant to intervene directly. His position was complicated not only by the sensitivity of the matter itself, but by the broader context of health and succession pressure already surrounding his reign. Rather than stepping into confrontation, he reportedly allowed discussions to unfold within advisory frameworks, a decision that preserved space for interpretation but also extended uncertainty. In that uncertainty, every faction began reading silence in its own way. As concern deepened, palace communications became noticeably tighter. Internal messaging systems were restricted, briefings became more controlled, and language across official channels grew increasingly neutral. What was not said became as important as what was. The absence of clarity created an atmosphere where even minor signals carried disproportionate weight, and within that environment, speculation naturally intensified. Yet no formal statement followed, only carefully maintained restraint. Outside the palace walls, media insiders began detecting a coordinated quiet across multiple royal offices. Not denial, not confirmation, just a synchronized reduction in commentary that suggested alignment rather than confusion. For those accustomed to reading patterns in institutional behavior, this kind of silence often signals that something is being actively managed at a higher level, even if the details remained deliberately undisclosed. The effect was not to calm speculation, but to sharpen it. And within this increasingly controlled environment, one realization began to take hold across different corners of the institution. The clause was no longer just a document under review. It had become a point of structural tension, pulling every major figure into its orbit, forcing interpretation where certainty no longer existed. At this stage, Princess Anne decided the matter could no longer remain within advisory channels. It required formal exposure. Princess Anne reportedly initiated a formal internal audit of the clause, invoking a long-standing constitutional oversight authority that is rarely activated unless the monarchy itself senses a structural imbalance. What followed was not noise or confrontation, but something far more controlled, an intervention described by insiders as precise, disciplined, and deliberately restrained. Yet its impact was immediate. The conversation that had once lived in speculation and cautious interpretation was pulled, almost instantly, into the formal machinery of institutional review, where every word, every definition, and every implication would now be examined with absolute seriousness. The moment Princess Anne activated the internal constitutional review protocol, the clause was no longer treated as a quiet legal curiosity. It was escalated upward through royal governance structures that typically operate behind layers of procedural distance, reaching senior advisory and legal verification teams who are trained to assess not just legality, but constitutional consequence. In that transition, alone, the tone shifted. What had been debated in private discussion was now being handled as a matter that could influence the long-term architecture of royal continuity itself. As scrutiny intensified, internal reviewers reportedly marked the situation as crossing what is referred to as an institutional integrity review threshold, a point at which a document ceases to be merely interpretive and becomes structurally significant to the functioning of the monarchy. That designation changed everything. It meant the clause could no longer remain within flexible advisory interpretation. It had to be formally justified or formally dismantled. There was no middle ground left in the process once that threshold was acknowledged. Within this tightening framework, Prince William and Catherine, Princess of Wales, were reportedly briefed together under strict confidentiality, away from public narrative and outside normal communication channels. The tone of these briefings, according to those familiar with internal procedure, was careful but direct, focused on clarity rather than speculation. For Catherine, whose presence in earlier discussions had already made her family line central to the interpretation of the clause, the briefing placed her directly within the heart of the unfolding institutional process, not as a subject of debate, but as a figure whose future lineage was now part of constitutional consideration. At the same time, Queen Camilla's representatives were formally notified that the clause had entered structured review proceedings. This was not presented as accusation, but as procedural necessity. Still, the shift in language carried weight. Formal notification meant the matter had moved beyond informal discussion and into documented institutional handling, where every response would be recorded, assessed, and potentially revisited in later stages of governance interpretation. Within palace circles, such notifications are never symbolic, they are functional. Markers that something has crossed into official accountability. King Charles III, meanwhile, was described as maintaining a cautious non-interventionist position, shaped significantly by ongoing health constraints and the broader sensitivity surrounding succession-era governance. His approach, as characterized by insiders, was to allow the process to proceed through its established constitutional pathways rather than impose immediate direction. That decision, whether strategic or circumstantial, effectively left the review process to unfold under the authority of institutional mechanisms already in motion, reinforcing the perception that this was no longer a matter of preference, but of structural necessity. As all of this unfolded, the language surrounding the clause itself began to change. What had once been referred to in quieter terms as a protective safeguard was now increasingly framed within internal discussions as a governance anomaly. That shift in terminology was not cosmetic. It reflected a deeper change in how the clause was being understood, no longer as a passive element within trust structures, but as something that actively challenged expectations of uniformity within royal financial and constitutional design. And as the review expanded, one reality became increasingly unavoidable. Once formal constitutional review is triggered at this level, ambiguity cannot survive for long. Every assumption must be tested, every origin traced, every implication accounted for, until the structure either holds under scrutiny or collapses under its own contradictions. Once formal review began, the clause could no longer remain hidden, it had to be either justified or dismantled. As scrutiny deepened, interpretations of the clause began to fracture in a way that no one within the advisory structure could fully contain. What had started as a tightly controlled constitutional review now split into sharply opposing readings, each side anchored in the same document but arriving at entirely different conclusions. Some advisors insisted the clause was nothing more than a protective mechanism, carefully designed to preserve royal continuity during periods of uncertainty, a stabilizing thread woven into the monarchy's long-term governance fabric. Others, however, saw something far more deliberate within its structure, arguing that it subtly redefined inheritance influence in a way that elevated the future position of Catherine's children, shifting internal balance in a direction that could echo for decades. Within these diverging interpretations, legal and constitutional panels found themselves locked in extended analysis, unable to settle on a unified reading. One interpretation suggested the clause strengthened independent protection for the direct lineage of Prince William and Catherine, Princess of Wales, ensuring their children would be shielded from external structural pressures that historically influenced royal financial and governance decisions. In this view, the clause was seen as a modern stabilizer, quietly reinforcing continuity in an era where the monarchy faces increasing institutional complexity and public scrutiny. But critics within the same advisory environment raised a different concern entirely. They argued that the clause, intentionally or not, reduced external household influence over future heirs by narrowing the scope of shared governance structures. In doing so, it appeared to concentrate long-term protective authority within a more defined lineage pathway, subtly altering the traditional balance that has long governed the distribution of influence across the wider royal household. This interpretation did not accuse the clause of wrongdoing, but it did challenge its neutrality, and in constitutional terms, neutrality is everything. As debate intensified, Princess Anne reportedly became one of the strongest voices calling for full transparency not just of the clause itself, but of its historical justification. Her position, as described by insiders, was rooted in institutional memory. She was not questioning intent lightly, she was questioning continuity. Why was this language inserted in this way, and why did it survive multiple layers of governance without triggering earlier review? For Anne, these were not rhetorical questions, but structural ones, demanding answers that went beyond surface interpretation. At the same time, Queen Camilla's advisory circle began raising its own set of concerns, focusing on the timing and selective application of the clause. The issue was not simply what it protected, but when its implications had become visible and how its interpretation now seemed to align with shifting internal dynamics within the monarchy. The selective nature of the debate itself became part of the controversy, as different factions began to perceive uneven attention being paid to different branches of the royal structure. Throughout all of this, Catherine maintained a consistent public silence, reinforcing a narrative of stability even as internal discussions grew increasingly complex around her family's position within the clause. That silence, however, did not remove her from the center of the conversation, it reinforced her presence within it. In many ways, the absence of public commentary created a contrast between external calm and internal intensity, deepening the perception that what was unfolding was not a public dispute, but a constitutional balancing act occurring entirely behind institutional walls. As the review process continued, palace tensions increased, but remained carefully contained within controlled channels of communication. There were no public statements, no official confirmations, and no visible disruptions in royal duties. Yet beneath that surface stability, the internal atmosphere became more charged. as every interpretation of the clause seemed to pull the institution in a slightly different direction. Even restraint itself became a form of pressure, holding competing perspectives in place without allowing resolution. And as this quiet tension reached its peak, attention began to shift away from the wording of the clause alone, toward a far more uncomfortable question, one that no longer focused on legality or structure, but on intent itself. With interpretation unresolved, attention shifts from the clause itself to the deeper question: who truly benefits from its existence? What began as a quiet legal discovery inside the deeper corridors of royal governance slowly transformed into something far more delicate, one of the most sensitive constitutional discussions the modern monarchy had faced in recent memory. The hidden clause, still wrapped in layers of interpretation and hesitation, stood at the center of it all, its meaning shifting depending on who examined it and from which constitutional angle it was viewed. Whether it was protective by design or strategic by consequence no longer mattered as much as the fact that it had forced the institution into a rare and uncomfortable moment of self-examination. Under Princess Anne's firm and uncompromising oversight, that examination was no longer theoretical, it had become official, structured, and unavoidable. Even as the process continued, the clause itself remained under formal review, with no public confirmation and no official acknowledgement beyond carefully controlled internal channels. Silence was not accidental, it was procedural. Every layer of communication surrounding the matter was tightened, shaped to preserve institutional stability while avoiding any signal that could be misinterpreted externally. Within this controlled silence, Princess Anne emerged as a central stabilizing authority, her role shifting from observer to active constitutional anchor. Her involvement was not about disruption, but about containment, ensuring that whatever the clause represented, it would be resolved through institutional logic rather than public speculation. As the review deepened, Prince William and Catherine, Princess of Wales, increasingly appeared at the center of interpretive frameworks surrounding the clause. In one reading, they were the clear beneficiaries of a carefully constructed protective structure designed to safeguard their direct lineage and reinforce continuity in an uncertain institutional era. But even that interpretation carried weight because protection at that level inevitably reshapes balance elsewhere. What strengthened one branch of continuity inevitably redefined the space around it, whether intended or not. At the same time, Queen Camilla's influence within advisory discussions was reportedly recalibrated, not removed, not diminished outright, but repositioned within a more carefully defined interpretive structure. Her presence in the conversation remained, but the framework around it had subtly shifted, reflecting the broader institutional effort. Maintain equilibrium while navigating competing readings of the clause. In such moments, even small adjustments in advisory language carry long shadows, reshaping perception without altering formal authority. Throughout the process, King Charles III maintained a careful balancing role, shaped as much by constitutional responsibility as by the realities of his ongoing health recovery period. His approach, as described within internal circles, leaned toward preservation of continuity above all else, allowing institutional mechanisms to function without abrupt interruption. That stance ensured the process remained contained within governance structures, but it also meant that resolution would come through interpretation and procedure rather than direct intervention. Externally, the palace continued to emphasize unity and continuity, carefully avoiding any acknowledgement of internal divergence. Official language remained steady, deliberate, and neutral, reinforcing the image of a cohesive institution even as multiple interpretive threads moved beneath the surface. What was not said publicly became just as important as what was spoken, and that silence itself began to function as a protective layer around the entire discussion. In the end, the outcome of the review was increasingly framed not as conflict, but as reinforcement of institutional stability, a careful repositioning of understanding rather than a rupture of authority. Each side of the interpretation was absorbed into a broader narrative of continuity, where even disagreement could be reframed as part of the monarchy's adaptive strength. Yet beneath that framing, the weight of what had been uncovered did not disappear. It simply settled deeper into the structure, becoming part of its unseen architecture. And as the palace sealed the documents once more, one truth lingered beneath the silence. Sometimes the most powerful shifts in monarchy are not the ones announced, but the ones quietly written into. Clauses no one was ever meant to question. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.